Dear children, in today's session, we'll be discussing an interesting topic is pollination. At the end of this session, you will be able to know the definition for pollination and you will be able to differentiate between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Okay, children. So, let us start our class. So the process of pollination is closely related to the topic that we discussed yesterday. So kindly remember what we discussed in our last class. Okay children, in our last class we studied about the reproductive parts of flower. I think you all are remembering that. So here the stamen is the male reproductive part which consists of anther at the top and the thread-like structure filament. Okay, this we studied by cutting the flower and its parts in our last class. Is it children? So kindly remember that. So it will be very useful for you to understand this concept. Okay, so the stamen, anther and filament together is known as stamen, which is the male reproductive part of the flower. And the next part is female reproductive part of the flower, which is known as pistil. The pistil consists of three parts in it, that is stigma, style and ovary. Inside the ovary we have a granule-like structure that are ovules. Okay, so here the stigma acts as a receptor to receive the pollen grains or anther. Okay, the stigma is very sticky in nature and the style acts as a pollen tube, okay, which connects ovary and the stigma. So it acts as a pollen tube through which the pollen grains are transferred and reaches the ovary. Inside the ovary we have ovules. Okay, so this is about a female reproductive part of the flower, that is pistil. Okay children, now let us learn what is pollination. Okay, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. Okay, so listen carefully children. The transfer of pollen grains. Okay, the anther consists of pollen grains which is transferred to the stigma of a flower. Okay, so this process is known as pollination. Okay, transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma is known as pollination. Okay, in pollination we have two kinds. One is self-pollination and the another one is cross-pollination. Okay, let's study one by one in detail. First, let us see what is self-pollination. Okay, self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a same flower or another flower from the same plant. Okay, listen carefully. Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or to the another flower of the same plant. Okay, so this is known as self-pollination. The plants which are formed by self-pollination are apples, grapes, plums, pears and berries, all kinds of berries, that are raspberry, blueberry and strawberries. Okay, these are the plants which are formed by self-pollination process. Now let us study about cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains, that is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the different plant. Okay, cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the another flower. Okay, to the stigma of another flower that is different plant of the same species. For example, if it is an hibiscus plant, from one plant of hibiscus to another hibiscus plant, the process of pollination occurs. That is, pollen grains are transferred from one hibiscus plant to another hibiscus plant. Okay, so this process is known as cross pollination. I'll repeat once again. Cross pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower of different plant of the same species. Okay, plant may be different but its kind is same. If it is hibiscus plant, means same hibiscus. Okay, so anther from one hibiscus to stigma of the another hibiscus is transferred. So this kind of pollination is known as cross pollination. Okay, plants which are formed by this kind of pollination, that is example for cross pollination is apples, pumpkins and grasses. Okay, so we have apple for both the kind of pollination. So apples are formed by self pollination and cross pollination. I hope you understood the topic pollination and its kinds. Yes, children, let us meet on next class with some other interesting topic. Thank you, children.